Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 6, beginning of verse 13. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as we continue through the narrative of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den unfairly, help us to see the ways in which this is a foreshadowing of Jesus, who also was innocent and was unfairly executed by Pontius Pilate. And as Daniel is a foreshadowing of Jesus, we also see that this book is important for our lives as we can recognize your work in the inspiration of this prophecy and your continued speaking to us today through the power of your Holy Spirit. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so last week I spent a lot of time talking about like the background of the beginning of chapter 6 because it mentions Darius the Mede. And so like the very last verse of chapter 5, verse 31 mentions Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. And then chapter 6, verse 1, which in the Hebrew is actually, chapter 6 starts with chapter 5, verse 31 in the Hebrew. And most likely because in the Hebrew numbering of the verses in the chapters, they felt that those verses went together because they wanted to keep all the information about Darius in the same chapter. But in the English version, it's slightly separate. But originally there were no, chapter or verses in the original manuscript, so it's really kind of an editorial thing rather than an inspired thing. But we talked about the most likely scenario is that Darius the Mede is the same person as Cyrus the Great. And there's several reasons for that. Because of the details that are listed about Darius, it mentions his age. In chapter 5:31, it mentions his appointing 120 satraps, which are like governors, in 6:1. He talks about his authority to write to all the people in 6:25. That he reigned for at least part of 1 year in chapter 9, verse 1, and 11, verse 1. It mentions he was a Mede in chapter 5:31, but as well as in 9, chapter 1. And he received the kingdom in chapter 5:31, and that the conquest of Babylon ended ended Daniel's service with Babylon when Darius showed up, and that was actually mentioned in chapter 1, verse 21. So all this information about Darius, it actually fits best with Cyrus, and the reason has to do with that Cyrus was, and you can see on some of my bullet points, that Cyrus was born of a Median mother and a Persian father. So he actually came from a line of Medes. So calling him Darius the Mede is recognizing his heritage. But notice it doesn't say king of the Medes. It just called him Darius the Mede. And so that's probably evidence that it's less about his being the king rather than it was probably like his given name, and then his Persian royal name was Cyrus. Now, of course, theories about this go back and forth. The other theory is that it was actually a guy, the first general who got into the city of Babylon when they destroyed the city. You know how they snuck in through the water gates, and that I think the other person's name was let's see if I can remember his name, Gabirus or something like that. The thing about that general is that he only lived 25 days after the destruction of Babylon. So there's no way that he would have been able to do all the things that I just read about that Darius had done if Darius was actually this general. So it's most likely he was actually just another name for Cyrus. And in this section, of course, we're talking about Daniel in the lion's den, probably one of the best known passages in Scripture, at least just the, kind of like the children's Sunday school version. We don't always know the details, and that's what we're going to look at today. So today, as we dig into verse 13, we'd already talked about, how Darius is fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah 44, which talked about how Cyrus would free Israel from Babylonian exile, and that's what Darius does, and that's what Cyrus is supposed to do. So it seems like that should be the same person. And in Isaiah 45, it actually says that God will do this, will free the Israelites from exile through the Medes and the Persians. So it mentions both countries. So by mentioning both of those, which also Daniel mentioned back in chapter 5, that it was the Medes and the Persians who overtook the Babylonians, then for Cyrus to be both from a Median and a Persian heritage fulfills the prophecy perfectly. I think Daniel was purposely trying to show that yes, indeed, a lot of people thought of Cyrus as just a Persian king, but if he had a Median mother, then it does make sense that he fulfills the prophecy perfectly. People outside of the biblical, the faithful interpretation are looking for evidence from historical records that currently don't exist, but an argument from silence isn't really an argument. You can't simply say, well, obviously they can't be the same person because we've never heard of anybody such as Darius the Mede. And the biggest example of that from archaeology was in the 1800s. Historical critical scholars claimed that there was no Pontius Pilate because we'd never found any inscription about him outside of the Bible until they found in Jerusalem, until they did, right? And so I think that it's interesting that a lot of conservative scholars actually argue, just wait a couple of decades and we'll see what happens, because more and more evidence from the Middle East keeps being uncovered. I mean, if you follow the news, every day I read about some new thing, like they found in Jerusalem, like in the book of Chronicles, it talks about how there was a moat around the city of Jerusalem during the time of David. But everybody thought that was just made up. And then last year they found a really deep section where there was a wall, and then there was a little wall next to it, and then there was sediment. There was a moat around the city of David in Jerusalem during the time of King David. So just as the Bible says it was, 4,000 years, they found this evidence from almost 4,000 years ago. And so it's amazing that they're still finding stuff to prove the Bible right. There hasn't been anything that's proven the Bible wrong, though. That's the thing, is that some other religions or other cults come up with ideas that can't be proven. They could say the same thing, argument from silence. But ultimately, if you have no evidence at all of like a people or coins or pottery or any of that stuff, or names, like the Book of Mormon has lots of names of people that never has been found in any other writing anywhere in the world ever. So to say that book is true would be a huge stretch of the imagination. So, because God doesn't expect us to check our brains at the door. God, the Bible is not blind faith. We take a leap of faith. There's a difference. A leap of faith is, as it says in the New Testament, I think it's in Hebrews, faith in what we cannot see, but we're trusting in God's promises that He's revealed through things like sending His Son Jesus, by sending the prophets to proclaim that God was going to save us. The things that the Old Testament teaches about God's love and His hatred of sin and His plan to save us from our sin, which is through the sacrifices which foreshadow Jesus' ultimate sacrifice. Okay, and then so we answered the first question there about the prophecy of Isaiah. Then the second question about what details about Darius could only be true of Cyrus. After some of the things I just mentioned, anybody think of those? What were some of the things that Darius would have to be Cyrus? Because I mentioned about his ability to to appoint the 120 satraps, right? That's not something that would have been delegated to somebody underneath the king, right? So it has to be the same person. Yeah, and writing to all the nations, right? Who would be able to give a royal decree that everybody could listen to unless Darius was the same as Cyrus? Because only the king could have done that. Okay, and then then the third one that we'll talk about today is, why were the wise men so jealous of Daniel, and how is their trap different than the punishment of the 3 Judean men in the fiery furnace in chapter 3? Right, so as we look at this section, keep that in mind. Okay, would somebody read verse 13 from chapter 6?
Then they said to the king, Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day.
Okay, so what are some of the accusations that the wise men who don't like Daniel are telling the king?
No good, he came from Judah.
Yeah. Okay, so by calling him, he's from the exiles of Judah. What is he actually saying?
He's a foreigner.
Okay, a foreigner. That's right. He's a servant, an exile. Well, he was exiled by the Babylonians. So, where do you think his faithfulness would be, or his loyalty? Where would his loyalty be? That's right. Not to the Persians, not to the Babylonians, but to Judah and to his God. And so he's really calling into question his loyalty. Is this a person you should put your trust in? Because obviously, because remember back in the beginning of this chapter, it mentioned in chapter 6, verse 1, it pleased Darius to appoint the 120 satraps, and it goes on to say, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, that is to Daniel and the others, so that the king might not suffer loss. So he's in verse 3. Now Daniel was so distinguished among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So obviously, Darius has a high view of Daniel, and the only way you're going to alienate Daniel from King Darius is to paint him in a light that shows that he's diabolical, he's dangerous, he's going to stab you in the back. But Daniel obviously never had those qualities. I mean, he served the kings of Babylon and didn't betray them. But that doesn't mean that they didn't, like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that just because they were faithful to the kings didn't mean that they did everything the king said. Because, as we had already read in chapter 3 and 5, that the king had tried to force them into doing things that they didn't want to do, like worship idols, right? And so they disobeyed when it came to what God's law was. But ultimately, the wise men not only are saying that he's a foreigner, but what other thing did he say?
Well, saying he's disrespectful. He's not paying any attention to the king or his injunction.
That's right. So what kind of a...
Thumb in his nose.
That's right. What do you think that means by saying? Because literally it says Daniel. It says upon Daniel he set his mind. No, I'm sorry. That's the next one. He pays no attention to you. So he's making a claim that he's not paying attention to the king, which is kind of a strange way of saying that he's disloyal.
What verse is that?
Verse 13. Yeah, he pays no attention to you. And so they're claiming that Daniel does what he wants to do, and so he ignores the authority of the king. So by ignoring the authority, he's dangerous, right? So he's a rebel, and he can't be trusted.
He didn't pay attention to the injunction either. Law.
Yeah, and so it's like they're trying to. But there's no evidence that he was actually paying no attention to the king. But I guess by extension, he was paying no attention to the king by not listening to the king's decree. But it wasn't really the king's decree. Whose decree was it? Yeah, the wise men. The wise men, they actually pushed it on him. Yeah. So back in verse 8. The wise men said to the king, now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered. So they told him, oh, don't you think everybody should be worshiping you? And the background behind that was that Darius/Cyrus had allowed all the different nations that were taken over by the Babylonians to return their gods back to their temples, which is exactly what we find in history, is that Cyrus allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild their temple. But they didn't just do it for the Jews, they did it for all the gods. And so other groups that had gods, their golden statues had been stolen from whatever location they originally were at, and they were taken to Babylon. So they were all in the vaults, right? And then when he issued the decree, all these gods had to be taken back to where they came from. But it was an easy thing. It took them a while to get them all back. So there was probably a month-long period of time where people who would normally pray to the idols couldn't, because the idols were in transit back to their original locations, their temples, and that those temples hadn't been built yet. So people were worried, who are we going to pray to? Right? It's interesting how different that is for the Jewish people. They didn't have to worry. Sure, Jerusalem was destroyed, but their God did not dwell in the temple. And that's the difference between the Bible and other pagan religions, because God didn't need the temple. He allowed Solomon to build it in order to place his name upon it. And it was for the purpose of prayer and for forgiveness. But the pagans didn't have any place to pray. They couldn't pray to their gods while their gods were not physically there or at the temples. So during this 30-day period, they say, okay, all the people in the city don't know who to pray to because their gods are gone in transit. So let's have them pray to you. And so it was really kind of a way of keeping the peace, is that King Darius was trying to, he probably agreed to it because he thought, well, that sounds like a good idea in the meantime, until everybody is settled back with their religious rituals. But
it's interesting that it says he still prays 3 times a day, but they're all required to pray to the king. So somehow he knew, there's an implication here that he's praying to his God and not to you or something.
Yeah, well, because he had already been doing it, so Daniel had the practice of praying to God 3 times, the God of Israel, right, Yahweh, 3 times a day. And so since they knew that this was his practice, they figured that by making a law that would contradict his practice would be a good way of catching him. Because that's the whole point, is they wanted to catch him and get him in trouble. They try to alienate, because Darius was predisposed towards Daniel, so they try to alienate Daniel from the king by claiming that he's in exile, he can't be trusted, that he, and then this prejudice basically saying, he doesn't follow the Persians and Medes laws, but he follows his own law. He does what he wants. So that means he's dangerous, and he's not loyal. And then by saying that he doesn't pay attention, that part actually there's no evidence, because there was evidence that he disobeyed the law because he was praying to his God, but there was no evidence that he didn't pay attention to Darius. So what they're trying to do is bring up this other false accusation and try to trump up the charges to make it look like the other one is true. So it's obviously true that he was praying to another God, but the fact that he didn't pay attention to Darius, so that doesn't necessarily have to do with the law itself. It's not like, he ignored the law, so he's not paying attention to you. He's really trying to say, or the wise men are trying to say, that Daniel, he's just putting on an act. That the only reason he talks to you is to pacify you, and he tells you what you want to hear, but he doesn't really care about you. So, but we know that that's not true, because the way that Daniel served Nebuchadnezzar, as well as even Belshazzar, he wasn't disrespectful to him. He read the writing on the wall, and he interpreted it, and then he was blessed with rewards that time. So Darius actually has a good relationship with Daniel, and they're trying to destroy that, because they know that that's kind of, for them, that's a dangerous thing. They got to get rid of him. So his disobedience is actually shown to be a lot worse, because they passed the law that said if anybody prays to any other god besides the king, then they should be put into the lion's den. So what happens if he just accidentally prayed one? They just saw him like maybe praying over a meal or something like that. Maybe they would say the king could have said, well, it's not like he's doing this all the time. But because they said he's doing it 3 times a day, they're showing that he has a pattern and that he's willfully rebelling against the law, which is a lot worse than just saying he accidentally did it. So what as we move on to the next verse, we see that the king is trying to protect him. Go ahead and read verse 14.
Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed, and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him.
So, here we just have like a very short description of what he did, but it tells us that the king was trying to help him all day long until the sun went down. It doesn't say what it was, but if you try to imagine what kinds of things could Darius possibly have done to try to save Daniel from going into the lion's den?
I'd follow his commands.
Okay, so what?
Not using the king as the god.
Right. Well, okay. What could the king have done to try to save Daniel after he got caught?
Well, he probably was looking into the law to see if there's any way that, even though it was according to the Medes and Persians, that he could
Right.
still revoke it, or look for some kind of mitigating circumstance. Daniel, tell me you're not really praying in there 3
Yeah.
times every day.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the kind of thing that that this section of Daniel is trying to imply. It doesn't give us all the details, but definitely the king would have had to do something like it would have taken all day sometimes to consult the right lawyers to find the right loophole, and they poured over the details of the law, and probably not just that law, but other laws in the past that they could find a precedent that maybe he could be freed. But at the end, he was at a loss, right? So he couldn't, the experts couldn't find any reason to get him off. He couldn't try to annul the decree because they kept repeating. It's interesting how they say it like 3-4 times that about how the edict cannot be changed. Okay, so he spends the whole day trying to save him. Verse 15.
Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed.
So it's amazing how often they keep repeating this, because this is the only real charge that they can get to stick. It says, you said nobody can pray to anybody else, and then you can't change the law. So this is what they had planned all along. And so actually, what is that showing to Darius? When Darius is being confronted by the wise men who keep repeating, you can't change the law that you made, what does he realize about them?
They snuck that law in there with ulterior motives.
That's right. So they're actually lying to him. I mean, they were trying to deceive the king, and the king is trying his hardest to try to save Daniel, and yet he gets to the point where he kind of throws up his hands. There's nothing else he can do. Does that sound like any other person in the Bible?
I'm sure.
That's right.
John the Baptist.
Okay, yeah, the King Herod with John the Baptist, where it actually said that Herod liked John the Baptist, and that was only because his new wife was mad at John that she told her daughter when the king made the promise that go ahead and ask for anything you want after she danced for him, and then the mother is the one who asked for John's head on a platter. But then also Jesus with, like you said, Pontius Pilate, because Pontius Pilate says, I find no wrong in him. So Jesus was considered to be innocent, but he gave in to the crowds, or at least to the ones who were pressuring him to do it, and because he couldn't find any way around it, right? So Pontius Pilate, well, the difference is that there was no law that said Jesus had to be killed, because he could have just said to the Jewish leaders, I'm not going to listen to you. But they were using blackmail. They said, if he said he was the king of the Jews, they said, we have no king but Caesar. And by saying that, they're telling they're saying that if Pontius Pilate let him go, then he was allowing a traitor or a guy who tried to claim to be king when Caesar was the only king. So, they're trying to blackmail him. That's in the Gospels where Pontius Pilate does the same thing, but he gives in, right? Because it's the easiest way to do it. Although in here, I don't know if Darius is giving in because it's the easiest thing to do. It's a little bit different.
Well, it seems to me Darius is being driven to God, because God is the only way that Daniel can be saved. It's
Mhm.
kind of driving Darius to faith. It said he worked so hard. He was
Yeah.
probably praying for an answer or for a miracle
Yeah.
of some sort. And then even when the decree was handed down, take Daniel to the lion's den. So he was still praying, and he was still,
Yeah.
this was gonna bring him to really believe in the God of
Right.
Daniel and the Hebrews.
Yeah, the book of Daniel is how God is witnessing through the exiles to these pagan cultures, right? And so the Babylonian culture in chapters 1 through 5, Daniel and the three young men witnessed their faith, and then Nebuchadnezzar, he acknowledges that the God of Israel is the greatest of the gods at the end of his insanity and stuff like that. But then Belshazzar, who doesn't do that, is the one who gets punished and he loses the kingdom. But now you see that those first 5 chapters are contrasting with this new empire. So the Persian Empire with Cyrus or Darius is now being shown in the same way to be Daniel to be a witness to the true God, and it's going to have an effect on him, right? So Darius is he's not going to actually claim that Yahweh is the only God, so he never becomes a monotheist, but he does acknowledge that your God is powerful enough to save you, and he acknowledges that, which is an amazing thing. But the comparisons with Jesus are they're so obvious and amazing. I think it's worth looking at some of the things that are close. For instance, both Daniel and Jesus pray regularly, right? So there's lots of places in the New Testament that talks about Jesus praying regularly. So when Daniel's praying regularly 3 times a day, it's kind of showing us the pattern of Jesus. And also, both Daniel and Jesus had malicious accusers who tried to entrap them, right? So like Daniel 6:5 and Matthew 4:6 through 10 talks about the Pharisees trying to trap Jesus. Both of them have crowds bring them to a pagan ruler, where they're grabbed by, the Daniel's taken, or at least the wise men confront the king with Daniel, and then that's the same thing what happens to Jesus when he's brought before Herod and Pilate. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Daniel doesn't pray for himself. He doesn't pray to God to save him or to take this cup from me.
Right. Yeah. That's a different. That is a difference, because it doesn't mention his praying after. Well, I don't know once we get further along. His praying is just his pattern. So 3 times a day he's praying, and then he gets thrown into the lion's den because of his praying. But it doesn't. I don't know if it says that he's praying in the lion's den. Perhaps. But then Daniel and Jesus are both seen as innocent by the rulers. Both of them put their trust in God. Another one that's interesting is the comparison of a rock placed over the opening, right? And that's coming up and sealed. Yeah, Daniel 6:17 says that they placed a rock or a seal over the pit, and then Matthew 27:66 says that the tomb was sealed by Pontius Pilate.
And Daniel doesn't suffer like Jesus did.
Yeah, so you see, there are some contrasts. So when we talk about a foreshadowing, it's not always like a perfect match, but it is definitely setting us up for who Jesus will be. Both of them, at dawn, some people hurry to the place, right? So the king hurries at dawn in chapter 6:19, and the women hurry at dawn to the tomb in Matthew 28:1, and both emerge alive. So the important aspects of the life of Daniel in this instance and Jesus are so amazing that it really is a typology. Okay, let's look at verse, is it 16? Yeah. Daniel 6:16.
50, 60?
16.
So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you."
So there, like you were saying, is the evidence of the king getting closer to acknowledging the true God. So, he prayed to his own gods, but he is telling Daniel, I hope your God's, strong enough to save you. He probably didn't, know some of the things that had happened in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, right? I mean, that had happened over like 30 years earlier, right? Nebuchadnezzar, when he became insane, and then he came out of his insanity and acknowledged the God of Israel, right? That was back in chapter 5, but there was like a 30-year period between those. And so Darius probably doesn't know about that.
You said earlier that Darius was 60 years old. So he might.
Yeah, he might have, but they wouldn't have had any interaction, right? Because the Persians were the aggressor, and they attacked. When he attacked the city of Babylon, it was the great-grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, who was ruling at the time. So, he might have been it was 30 years earlier. He could have been, 30. So maybe he heard about it. But it's interesting to see that he has this connection with Daniel that is unusual. And actually, this is another fact that is super important. Why does Darius want to raise him up, Daniel, and why does he care about him, whether or not he's going to live? What are some reasons you can think of why Darius liked Daniel and didn't want to see him die?
He was gonna make him the head over all the whole country, right? at one point.
Yeah, right. So he wouldn't have done that if he didn't trust Daniel. So this idea that he's not trustworthy because he's a Judean exile, it doesn't hold water. So all the things that they're bringing, as the wise men are bringing against Daniel, it doesn't make sense, right? Darius realizes that he is trustworthy. I'm going to make him the head honcho over the Babylonian Empire. After I've taken it over, he'll be like my governor, because he'll do a good job. I don't know if when we first started talking about the book of Daniel in the background information, I mentioned how all the historical critical scholars claim that the book was written during the time of the Greek Empire, right? So the Greeks came in the 200s, the late 300s, the 200s. So that would have been like 150 years after the fact. So Daniel would have been long dead. So how is it that that the book could have been written in the 200s during the Greek Empire, and yet it's put into the situation or the time period of the Persians in the 400s and 500s? Why would that be? Well, their theory is that whenever you see the Persian emperor mentioned, it's actually just a code or a metaphor for the Greek kings, right? So I don't know if you guys know the infamous Greek king, who after Alexander the Great came through Israel and Syria, and then went all the way to India, right? This is around the 330s, and then 340s, and in 333, on his way back from India, he died of yellow fever, and then they broke the Greek Empire into pieces, and they had different kings that ruled different sections. So like the Seleucids ruled like Syria and Israel, and the Ptolemies, which was another general, ruled over the Egyptian area. So then eventually it came in the area of Israel. There was a king named Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And if you guys have heard the Maccabees, right? The Maccabees are there's 4 books of the Maccabees which were written, they're in the Apocrypha, which is the books that are written between the Old and New Testament time, during the time of the Greek Empire. So it tells us in the Maccabees books that Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, he forced the Jews to be Hellenized. That means that to take upon themselves the culture of the Greek Empire. So Hellenization meant you wear togas, you go to the bathhouses, you go to the Circus Maximus, watch people, running their races, and or the gladiators killing people, and for sport, and all the the worship of the gods, the pantheon of the gods. So all the stuff that the Greeks like to do, they've tried to get the Jews to do, but they wouldn't do it. And so what did Antiochus IV do? He figured, well, I'm going to get those Jewish people to do what I think is best. So he put a statue of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem, and then he slaughtered a pig on the altar to the Lord. And so this was a horrible desecration. And so it's actually going to be mentioned later on in Daniel. It's a prophecy of, talks about the abomination that desecrates the temple, right? And so most of them say, well, that happened when Antiochus the fourth, or Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, when he did this in like 163. So they say Daniel couldn't have known that. So that part was written in the 160s. So they're saying that whenever it mentions the people who are the Persian kings, that this is just a metaphor for the Greek kings. But there's a problem here. Did the Greek kings like the Jewish people? They did not. So one of the things Antiochus Epiphanes did is he lined up a Jewish couple, and then they had like 7 sons. And then he was going to force them to eat pork, and if they didn't do it, then he'd kill them. So they killed each son as they refused to eat pork, because they were going to desecrate the laws of the Torah. And so he killed each one of them until all 7 were dead, and then he poked the eyes of the parents out, because the last thing they would see was the death of all 7 of their sons. And this is found in the Maccabees. You could read it if you could get a copy of the Apocrypha. So you can read it online. It's usually, there's some, Catholic Bibles will have it in between the Old and New Testament. And so that was written around the time of the Greek Empire. So because Daniel mentions this kind of thing is going to happen, a lot of historical critical scholars are trying to place the writing of Daniel to the same period as the Greek Empire. But if the Persians are just another description, a metaphor for the Greeks, then how in the world do you explain how Darius has a favorable disposition towards Daniel, and he's trying to save him? And here he says, I hope your God can save you, and he doesn't want him to die. That goes against everything that we know about the Greek Empire. The Greeks never tried to save the Jews. They never cared about them. None of the kings were willing to allow the Jewish people to return. Right? It's only the Persians that did. Cyrus is the one who told the Jews, go back and rebuild your temple. But the Greeks are like, oh no, your temple has to be Greek, otherwise you can't be part of our empire. And then we're going to kill you if you don't obey us. So you have a disconnect with this theory. And I think that theory is, it's dangerous because it's based on the belief that miracles don't happen and that prophecy is always written after the fact.
So then do they figure that Psalm 22 was written in the 1st century AD?
So no, they wouldn't say that. They would say that David wrote it because he was talking about how he felt when Saul was trying to kill him, and he felt like God had abandoned him. And just because Jesus quoted it from the cross doesn't mean that it was talking about Jesus. It was just Jesus was appropriating.
So it's just circumstance.
Yeah.
It's just a coincidence that he talks about his hands and his feet being.
Right. Isaiah 53. That they would say that lucky guess, right? Lucky guess.
Yeah. Sounds like they believe in bigger miracles than more traditional Christians.
That's funny. That's a good point to make. Is that sometimes trying to twist the text to fit into a naturalistic explanation is a bigger miracle than the actual evidence. Okay, so Daniel is commended by Darius. Okay, verse 17.
And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel.
Okay, now, obviously, he knows that he can't really do anything, but he says, "I hope may your God save you." Back in verse 16. But why do you think he needed to seal the pit?
Well, Daniel had friends.
Oh yeah, so
That's first part.
if he cared about him, if Daniel's friends tried to rescue him, that wouldn't have been so bad. But it was probably the other reason, right? So by sealing it, he makes it tamper-proof. He's protecting Daniel from two things, right? He's protecting him from, showing that the king is not going to allow anybody else to intervene, but certainly the king wanted him to be saved. But what did the enemies of Daniel want?
They wanted him dead.
That's right. So if they noticed that the lions were not eating him, if they snuck in and killed him at night, then they could say, "Oh, look, the lions killed him," right? If you looked at the body close enough, you'd say, "Oh, it doesn't look like a lion's mouth. It doesn't look like teeth marks. It looks more like a stab wound or something." So he's actually sealing it in a way probably to protect Daniel from Daniel's enemies as well. There's several reasons behind that. But it's interesting how that's very similar to Matthew 27:66, where it tells us how Pontius Pilate sealed the tomb of Jesus, and so that nobody, because what was the reason why Pontius Pilate sealed the tomb of Jesus?
Because somebody was stealing the body.
Yeah, because that was what the enemies of Jesus were saying, that the disciples could steal the body, right? And
Make it look like he was resurrected.
right. Well, because even before Jesus was put in the tomb, that's what they were trying to avoid. And then, of course, if his body had been stolen, all they had to do is produce the body or something. But that wasn't anything that ever happened in the history of the first century. No matter how many times the enemies of Jesus tried to say that the body was stolen by his own disciples, it was never ever proven. But the text of the Bible tells us that that they paid the Sanhedrin, like the Jewish leaders, they paid the Roman soldiers to say that the body was stolen. They must have paid them a lot of money, because what was the penalty for abandoning your post? Yeah, so they would have been killed themselves. So the fact that they weren't killed I think that's pretty good evidence that that's not what happened. Everybody knew it was a lie. Everybody just went along their merry way with extra money in their pocket, and the embarrassment of the Roman Empire, saying that even to say that some hillbillies from Galilee stole the body, and how could they overpower a whole group of centurions, right? That doesn't even make sense. That would embarrass the centurions. So that would not be something they would want to say in the first place. So the fact that they resorted to that is pretty good evidence that that's not what happened. But here we see that or the king is trying to protect him from his enemies that could break in the middle of the night and have him killed, because they saw that the lions weren't doing anything. Okay, verse 18.
Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep.
So I think this shows, some of the evidence of King Darius's feelings towards Daniel, right? So what kinds of descriptions of his character do we learn from this? He's not eating, right? And most of the time, kings, they would have banquets, they would have entertainment, and then here, so he didn't have either of those, and he still couldn't sleep.
He's very, very pious, if that's the right word.
So maybe, I guess that could be a description. Most likely he's anxious because he thinks that he's going to be dead in the morning, right? And he doesn't want it, so he's foregoing all these things that he would normally do that would bring him pleasure, because he finds, his mind is consumed about Daniel. Yeah, and again, that is something that's so different than the way that the Greeks treated the Jewish people. So there's no way that those two eras can be connected, right? To say that this is just a description of the Greeks in the guise of talking about the Persian kings doesn't make sense. So Darius is actually, a king who cares about Daniel because he realizes that he's valuable, he's smart, and he's an asset. And any king who would get rid of a person like that would be stupid. But because of the jealousy of the wise men, he got betrayed. Okay, so he's losing sleep over Daniel. Okay, verse 19.
Then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions.
And this was the passage I think is very similar to what happens in Matthew 28, verse 1. It tells us that early in the morning before light or before dawn, the women rush to the tomb, right? So in essence, the lion's den is like a picture of a tomb, because there's no other reason for the lion's den except a place of death, right? So he should have been dead. I don't know if we didn't read a section that talked about how they treated the lions beforehand, but traditionally, they would starve the lions. No, they would actually feed them human bodies, and so they would have the taste of human flesh, and then they would starve them before they threw somebody in, so they'd be really hungry. So the idea that he would not be eaten is really miraculous, right? Obviously, but the wise men don't even see this, but the king is going to be the first to acknowledge that this miracle has occurred. Okay, verse 20.
As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?"
So this is the point that you mentioned earlier, is that if the reason why God allows this, couldn't God have stopped this from happening? But instead, he allowed it, just like God allowed Job to go through all of his struggles, where he allowed Jesus to go, through the crucifixion. The good news is that, Daniel didn't actually have to die in order to, bring the point across that God is in control. But God did allow Daniel to go through this because God was trying to draw Darius to the point of confession, right? So, and this is probably the biggest confession he has, because he calls God. What are some of the things he says about God? He says Daniel is a servant. He says, so he's basically saying Yahweh is a living God, right? Not a false God or a dead God. And then he calls him. He says that he's the one that Daniel serves continually, right? It's not just. A lot of times in the ancient world, people had several gods, right? And because there was a lot of polytheism, Daniel was unusual because he only believed in one God, where everybody else had, you have a God for. Today, sometimes you see this like in some denominations where you have like a saint for going on vacations, or you have the saint for, lost keys, or the saint for, protection of your property. But that's also true of other cultures. Like in Hinduism, they have a God for this and a God for that, right? And so everybody has their favorite God. But he was probably amazed that if Daniel was going to be safe, why didn't he pray to lots of gods to cover more bases? But he doesn't. Yeah, he didn't need to. So he's impressed, and his hope that he's alive is actually going to support his confessed faith. So he's calling Yahweh a living God. He sees that Daniel doesn't have any other gods. He's praying that he is being rescued. Okay, verse 21.
Daniel answered, "O king, live forever."
Very short verse, but what is Daniel's attitude towards the king? How does he address him?
Respectful.
Very respectful, which is his character. This is not new. He's not trying to butter up the king. He did it with Nebuchadnezzar, right? He said, like when he interpreted one of the dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, he actually said, may it only be for your enemies that such a horrible thing would happen. So, he was respectful. He wasn't as respectful to Belshazzar, but it wasn't that he was disrespectful. He basically just said, okay, this is what the writing on the wall says. But Daniel is not mad at the king for having made a law that had him put in jail, that could have had him killed, right? Because he's not trusting in the king or the laws to save him. He's only trusting in Yahweh. And the book of Daniel is all about how the exiles learned to put their faith in God again. Because before the exile, the people of Israel were worshiping idols in Jerusalem. It's kind of horrible to imagine, but it wasn't that unusual because, from the time that they got to, remember when Moses came down from the mountain and the people hadn't seen him for like 40 days and they thought he was dead. What was the first thing they did?
They erected that false god.
Yeah, they made a golden calf. So early on, they were worshiping a golden calf, and then during the time of, then they get into the promised land. And the book of Judges tells us that a judge would pass away, and then the people would start worshiping the idols again. And then God would allow them to be attacked by the Philistines, and then they would cry out to God. So they had to learn the hard way to worship God. So Daniel and the book of Daniel describes how the exiles have actually learned their lesson. They're worshiping the true God again. And this is to prepare for the coming of the Messiah, because how can the Messiah come if the people don't care about God and don't worship God anymore? But in some ways, though, humans love to make idols. So even though they stopped worshiping gold and silver idols during the time of Daniel, between Daniel and Jesus, the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees actually create a new idol. And the new idol isn't like of gold or silver, but the new idol is, can anybody imagine? What is it?
The law.
That's exactly, the law. They become so enamored with the law. Oh, we know the law so well. Be like us. We know how to keep the Sabbath day. If you don't do what we do, then you're not going to go to heaven. So the law became their idol. And they in a lot of ways, they worship themselves and their ability to keep it. And, God got written out of the picture. And then Jesus confronts them, and that's why he gets killed.
Are we to think that Daniel and Ezekiel, Daniel had the benefit of all Ezekiel's prophecies to help him for years after?
They would have been actually contemporaries.
Yeah.
They were probably taken into exile around the same time, around 597 BC. And but Daniel was he was listed as being brought into the wise men's school, and then he became a governor early on, whereas Ezekiel never mentions. He wrote prophecies, but his prophecies were being preached to the people in the exile, because the Jews were separated all throughout the Babylonian Empire. They were all taken out of Israel and moved there was pockets of them in different places around the empire. And so Ezekiel was in a different place, and he wasn't preaching or talking to the king. He was talking to the exiles.
Yeah, well, that's when you're talking about the exiles now they've gone away from their idols and they're starting to worship the true God again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was wondering, because Ezekiel, of course, he forecast all that stuff. And did Daniel kind of have a hint that this is coming? Or
well, most likely.
Did they get together?
Well, I don't know if. Okay, first of all, it never mentions that they were together, but they knew of each other because of some of the things that Daniel describes are similar to some of the prophecies of Ezekiel. So they may have known. Okay, Daniel wasn't considered a prophet though, so even the Hebrew Bible doesn't even list the book of Daniel with the prophets. So you got the former prophets are the history books, which is like 1 Samuel through 2 Kings, and then the latter prophets are there's Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then there's the 12 minor prophets. But Daniel is listed with the writings because the book of Daniel is written not the way that the other prophets are written, right? So like if you look through a lot of Isaiah, it's like indented because it's in Hebrew poetry, whereas Daniel is narrative. So it's kind of listed under the genre of apocalypse, right? So it's a different type of writing. So the book of Daniel is similar to the New Testament book of what?
Revelation.
Yeah, because they're both apocalyptic. They both have this picture of the end of the world type of stuff, and how these visions of crazy creatures are gonna foretell the coming of, battles and the end of the world type of stuff. So because of the type of writing Daniel was, it wasn't considered to be a traditional prophecy. It was prophetic, but it wasn't. They didn't think of Daniel as a prophet. They thought of Daniel as like for the Jewish people, that Daniel was like a governor who was inspired by the Holy Spirit, so that his life was an example of how to live faithfully. Right, so this is narratives. Like actually, the first 6 chapters are narratives, and once we get to chapter 7 through, is it through 10 or 11? Oh, Daniel 7 through 12 are all visions. Right, so the vision sections we're going to get to when we get to chapter 7 is really like the apocalyptic mainstay of the book that becomes very controversial because no Christian. So many different Christians have different interpretations of this section that we, can't agree. Well, if it's talking about end times, we're not at the end yet, so we won't know till the end. But yeah, Daniel and Ezekiel would have been contemporaries, but we know that Daniel was very long-lived, right? Because he lived into his 80s, and he lived through the time of Nebuchadnezzar when he was probably around 16. All the way to Cyrus's time, and he would have been in his 80s by then.
Well, the study Bible leaves no question that Daniel's a really important prophet.
Right, and one of the reasons why he's so important is because this is the last prophetic book that outlines who Jesus will be. Yeah, so it's actually like when we get to chapter 7, it's going to give us a countdown calendar, and part of that is where next time when we get to that chapter, the way that we interpret it, it talks about 77s. So we don't know if that's years or weeks, because the word for 7 is actually the same as the word for week, right? So which one is it? Is it 7 years or 7 weeks? But it really describes a kind of a countdown because really, if it's years, 490 years after Daniel is when Jesus appeared. So it is pretty amazing that the Jewish people, it wasn't a surprise that they were expecting the Messiah when John the Baptist showed up because they knew Daniel. Daniel basically said, 77s from now, the Messiah will come. And then he describes the Messiah in lots of different ways. And so everybody was like, trying to see, is Jesus going to fit this mold? And he fit some of the things that they expected, but most of the things that they paid attention to was that they thought the Messiah would be like a king who would seek vengeance against their enemies. But who did they think was the enemy of God's people?
Romans.
The Romans. Whereas, who is the real enemy of God's people? Satan. Right? Sin, death, and the devil, the evil trinity. So, God sent Jesus to destroy the ultimate enemies of God's people because, if you get rid of the Romans, that's just temporary. There'll be another country that'll come along that'll try to subjugate you after that. But God was protecting his people and all people who would put their trust in Jesus. So here you got Darius putting his trust in the God of Daniel, the living God of the universe, which is such an important witness. Okay, we'll do a couple more verses. 21.
He read that, didn't
22.
Oh, right, verse 22.
My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm.
So Daniel's confession is it tells us several things, right? It doesn't say that the lions' mouths couldn't open. It doesn't say that they weren't hungry, but it tells us an angel was sent, right? But of course, remember what the Hebrew word for angel is? It just means messenger, right? So we could translate it as God sent a messenger. So who is the messenger that was in the lion's den with him? I mean, sometimes there's a phrase, the angel of the Lord, in the Old Testament, but whenever it uses that phrase, sometimes it'll say, the angel of the Lord, and then it'll say, and God said. So is the angel of the Lord a messenger of God, or is the angel of the Lord God? The answer is it could be both, because they could be Jesus.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
Next to lesson, who's his sight? Who's his?
Let's see.
Who is his?
The angel.
I was found innocent in his sight.
Oh, in God's sight.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Just in small letters.
Right. Well, in the Bible, they don't usually capitalize pronouns for God.
But it
Mo-
doesn't even say God's sight. It just says his sight.
Right.
To assume that.
Yeah, but I think that's referring to God, because he's saying that, yeah, innocent in God's sight, and then he says, and also I'm innocent in your sight. So he's making a double statement of his innocence. Human kings could have people found guilty even if they're innocent, but the only thing that matters is God, right? So God is the one who proved Daniel's innocence by protecting him. But is that true all the time? Because you look at Job, and Job was assumed to be a sinner by his friends because of the very thing that was happening to him. If you were innocent, God would have protected you. So does God always protect the innocent? No. But ultimately he does, right? Because ultimately, if we're going to be, if we want to be theologically correct, none of us are innocent, right? It says in Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, which is actually a quote from the Proverbs, right? And it says, no one has done what is right, not one. All have sinned and gone astray. So we're all sinners. So Daniel doesn't deserve to be saved. He's just as sinful as anyone else. But he's claiming that what charges were brought against him by the wise men, and then this law that was basically a way of trying to get him in trouble, was proven to be wrong. He hadn't done anything wrong. So he's innocent in God's sight, but all the claims against him were also proven to be wrong as well, saying that he was an exile, he was of the Judeans, and that if he regularly prayed, knowing that the law said you shouldn't do that, then he was willfully rebelling against the king. So all those things were brought against him, but they're shown that those aren't proof. I mean, it's not that it's not true, right? It was true that he still prayed to his God, but it doesn't prove that he didn't like the king, or that he was trying to disobey the king.
Yeah, he wasn't trying to harm the king.
Right, wasn't trying to harm the king, right? So, because he was being faithful. So he says, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. I guess the king could say, well, I made a law and you disobeyed it, so you did something wrong. But he realizes that law wasn't really his. It wasn't his idea, and it wasn't a good law in the first place. It was just something that, out of jealousy, that they'd come up with. So Darius's confession here is similar to Nebuchadnezzar's confession at the end of chapter 5, when he says, the God of Israel is the greatest of the gods. So now you have got two great kings of two of the greatest empires in the world in the book of Daniel confessing Yahweh as the strongest God. And, then people who read this book in history, I mean, from the time of these kings all the way up till now, the lesson should be, if these pagan kings who out of their pride came to be humbled to see the truth, how is it that so many other people don't learn that lesson? Don't be like Belshazzar, who didn't see the writing on the wall and got killed. Be like Nebuchadnezzar and Darius, who saw the truth, and then but they didn't go far enough, because all they did was they acknowledged that Daniel's God was great, but they didn't go as far as saying, and I'm going to put my trust in Yahweh, because Daniel did that and it saved him. And so a lot of people thought that the historical critical scholars were trying to say that the book of Daniel was written to give encouragement to the Jews during the Greek attack, right, during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, that he was always attacking the Jews, and this book was written at that time to give them encouragement during their suffering. Well, the Jewish people were suffering long before that anyway, so to say that was the only suffering was crazy. They were suffering under the Babylonians, under the Persians, and then under the Greeks. So it could have been written by under any of those circumstances. But it is true that it does give encouragement to any of God's people who suffer unjustly under the laws of this world, because the world is never on God's side. And so it's always going to find ways to try to attack us. But we need to recognize that God will prevail ultimately. And so some pagan cultural icons might acknowledge that God exists, but God's not, he's not trying to convert the rest of the pagan world. He does want people to convert, right? But the main reason is to give hope to God's people who have faith. If you already have faith, it doesn't matter if you're thrown into a lion's den or not. But if you don't have faith, then God's going to use the circumstances of his people to bring the truth before their eyes. So in some ways we can welcome persecution, because that's one of the greatest ways that the truth will be brought before kings and emperors. And that's what St. Paul did, isn't it? Right? He was brought before Caesar himself. And Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate. So we see a lot of similarities. And maybe that'll happen to us, but we'd just pray that God will give us the words to say if we're placed in those circumstances. Okay, we'll stop here.